Thank you, and thank you all for coming. The skeleton of tonight's talk is one I've never given before. In 2001, I started a series of paintings based on the 613 obscure commandments that Jewish sages have extracted from the Bible. And the Orthodox community considers these to be the armature of the religion, even though 2/3 of them can't be practiced because they refer to a temple that hasn't existed for 2,000 years. However, there is a kind of spiritual attachment to these things. And I spent from 2001 to 2006 working on these pictures in my studio, and when I put them up in 2008 on a warehouse wall just to see what they looked like, they measured 17 feet high by 100 feet long, and it was one big painting. For a number of years, the book was shopped around to different publishers as something that would be reproduced, each contiguous panel as an individual page. And about a year ago, Random House, Penguin, Blue Rider Press published the book, and the book looks like this. Some of you may have seen it. It's a 613. The book became a kind of cult bestseller, to my shock. It's never been out of the Amazon top 100 in 2 categories, and for about 14 weeks it was #1. So I've been doing book tours all over the place. And most of the places I've been talking are places that have interest in their Judaic membership. So I can give a kind of friendly talk. But I myself am not a religious person. I'm an artist. And I knew that this evening I would be speaking to an audience of artists, art critics, art historians, curators, people who actually understood the language of what it is I'm about to say. So I put together a talk that I have never given before, and I probably will never give again because I will never have this audience. So we're going to start on this. The things I'm going to show are trying to weave together questions about scale, narrative, belief systems, surface, composition, relation to text, technical employment. All of these things come into play. And I guess I'll start. In 1966, I became very enamored of the work of Helen Frankenthaler. And I did a large number of paintings that ranged about 10 to 25 feet, where I would just stain on the floor and make a lot of dots mixing oil and acrylic paint. Acrylic paint at that time, for those of you who were around, was a kind of radical paint, and every artist had their own recipe for it because it had really just come on the market. And I started to hang out a few years later with people like Larry Poons, who would in fact very generously introduce me to that echelon of painters. So I was very fortunate at a very young age. So this is a painting from 1966, and the reason that I'm showing it to you is because it shows a certain kind of compartmentalization. Let me see if I get this right. Here we go. Here's another one from about the same time. I have a lot of conflicting enthusiasms, as John Ashbery once said. But I was also very interested in Jackson Pollock, and I knew that Dr. Atl had introduced in Mexico the kind of agenda that would give birth to the great Mexican muralist that Pollock was so interested in. Pollock was extremely interested in the work of Orozco. And I went back to look at those things that influenced Pollock, as a young painter would do. So I wanted to paint something that would look like an Aztec mural. You can see the scale of these things. I was not shy about scale. At the same time, there was almost an unspoken contest in the wake of the death of Jackson Pollock and among what later became the color field painters to see how big a painting you could paint. So I had no problem going to Astrup on Walker Street like all the other painters did and buying a 50-yard roll that would unroll to 150 feet and doing as large a painting as I could and then roll it up. But I was also interested in the notion of, for lack of a better word, content. And the Aztec murals were obviously religiously based. I was thinking about the Ajanta caves. I was thinking about Italian fresco cycles. And I knew that there was meaning in abstract expressionism, that abstraction was a language. But being the generation after Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg, you sort of come to realize that abstraction, figuration, and everything in between is in fact a kind of equal language. In the 1970s, abstraction was almost 100 years old as a language. So I found myself trying to find a place to put, for lack of a better word, belief. I had grown up looking at Pollock and Klein, and Newman, and I extracted belief from that. It occurred to me, I'm going to talk a little bit, then I'll go through these quickly. It occurred to me that the way bebop jazz had devolved into hard bop, which was a 3-chord blues structure, because they ran out of the Great American Songbook, that the language of faith or of belief in abstract expressionism had devolved into a kind of formalism by which basically everything was inherently compositional. And that meant that the paintings were almost interchangeable regardless of the style or technique employed. And I craved a certain kind of meaning. So when I was hanging out with, bless him, Larry Pooms, I would be looking at the painting of Larry's friends and colleagues, and I was wondering where the imperative for the narrative was, the unspoken narrative. Again, I'm a young painter, and I'm not the same age as these people. These people have come to a conclusion where that kind of color field, compositional and formal strength was acknowledged as being not only sufficient but paramount. And I still had this vestige of needing some kind of belief. I'm showing this now because it's going to end up being very similar to what ends up here 40 or 50 years later. So I was doing figurative work, and the figures, the lines started to become more and more disconnected. I was looking at the drawings of Abraham Wolkowitz doing drawings of Isadora Duncan and later Matisse, where I looked at these almost Edward Muybridge type movements that Wolkowitz was doing, where he would catch Duncan in different phases of her action. And because of that, he didn't connect his lines either. And I thought that was kind of interesting. It was very cinematic. As Leanne mentioned to you before, my degree was in cinegraphics, which is animation. So I was used to this kind of cell animation, this repetition with minor changes. And looking at, again, Pollock, I was looking at Pollock's Peggy Guggenheim mural. This painting, let's see, it's 6 feet high. It's probably about 30 feet long. Are those figurative elements that are brushed onto unprimed canvas. And there's a detail of that, and you can see that the figurative elements are becoming more and more disconnected to the point where I realized that they looked like letters. So this is like the first painting I made that looked like a letter. This is around 1967. And I called it to myself Z3V, and realizing many years later that it was the word sex. But I didn't acknowledge that at the time. And then I figured, let me throw some letters around and see if, again, I can extract some meaning just from the iconographic presence of those things. So there was a bunch of these. This is a drawing of, I think, 1,400 four-letter words. Whatever floated my boat at the time. The reason I included this, I've shown this once before, is because I found myself writing down the ingredients to an Italian pasta sauce where anchovy is a prime word. And I found a couple of years ago that Edward Richet, 2 years before, had also made a work that just said anchovy. And I wondered what was in the air that two artists would pick the word anchovy to make the subject of their picture. Finally, I landed on music. Maxine Brown, great rhythm and blues singer. And I realized that music was something I could invest my faith in when all of my other friends were shooting smack and doing all kinds of terrible things. I would find refuge in everything mostly from the African American community, mostly jazz and peripheral musics. And I decided that Maxine Brown was a perfectly good subject to work with. So I started a series called The Letter Paintings. These go from about 1967 to about 1970, 71 or so. You'll notice at the bottom here of this compartmentalized picture, I'm not consistent, by the way, I was doing this at the same time, is the word the Cadillacs, to which I refer to the rock and roll group, the Cadillacs. They used to call me Speedo, but my real name is Mr. Earl. And I thought that was pretty cool. So about 1967, I turned out this painting, the Cadillacs, based on what do I do with the letters now that I have them? Well, I use the letters to invest, for lack of a better word, faith. So this picture is rather large. You can't see it really, but on the left-hand side it says Jackson Pollock, and then my name, of course, is very big, and then it says Hothouse and Bebop, and there's a couple of other things written there. But you can see from the room that this is taken in that this painting is about 60 feet long. There's another version of it. There's the Moonglows, Clyde McPhatter, the Dell Vikings, the Cadillacs, Charlie Parker. There's a whole bunch of people in this picture. These are 4 titles by the composer Tad Dameron. At this time, as I mentioned, acrylic paint, I'm trying to overlay a lot of things. There's technical things, there's things about the paint, there's things about reflection on surfaces, all of which I'm kind of interested in. That if you add certain acids to the raw acrylic resin, we all made our own paint. You could force it through a pastry tube. I had a job for one day working at a lamp factory where they gave me a pastry tube and told me to put it on a cake turntable and make some squiggles. And I quit at lunchtime, but I'd learned that the pastry tube was really cool, so I used that. So this is a Hothouse, Fountain Blue, Good Bait, and Our Delight, 4 Tad Dameron songs. I'm just showing a couple of these. There's Cecil Taylor, Billy Bauer, Anita O'Day, and McCoy Tyner. This is about 30 feet. The Marvelettes. I looked at the 2 T's over there on the Marvelettes and thought it's how Edward Gorey would write something, you know. This painting has all kinds of jokes in it. Johnny Hodges, Gil Sorrentino. So I would make word jokes with myself, going from one Hodges to the next, from one Gil to the next. And the center of the picture is Carl Furillo, who played for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and he's next to Jelly Roll Morton and Big Maceo Merriweather and Sonny Rollins, and God knows what else is in this picture. But this is the kinds of techniques that were available to me at the time, and I used them. John Yao told me this might be the first spray painting ever done. These are pictures, people who don't want to be in the same picture together. Clifford Still, Giorgio Morandi, George Jones, Hank Ballard and the Midnighters, and Eddie Cochran, and behind them Fontella Bass, Mary Wells, Etta Jones, and I think Doris Troy is there too. And so this is the scale of some of these pictures. There's a Wilbur Ware picture, bass player with Thelonious Monk, Ernie Henry, alto sax, Bud Powell, of course. This was a show at Exit Art that we had in '91, but these pictures again date from '67 to '71. Fats Navarro. That Laverne Baker picture in the back is 40 feet long. It's Laverne Baker's name twice. Then I did some small ones. There's about 80 of these. I don't think I've ever shown these. Oh, I showed them once in Genoa, in the Palazzo Ducale. I showed some of them. But that's kind of the insanity that they look like. The poet Robert Duncan shares a canvas with Charlie and Inez Fox, Charlie Hayden, Maurice Williams and the Zodiacs, Jimmy Jones and the Pretenders, Doris Troy, and Maxine Brown shows up again. I love Maxine Brown. Then I figured, you know, what kind of painter isn't painting images? I had a real crisis of faith there. So I said, well, I've got to paint an image. I don't know what to paint. And so this is a rather large painting with whatever I could get out of it. And at this time, I'm relating to people only in retrospect, but I realize at that time, I'm doing something rather similar to painters like Joan Snyder, whom I admire very much. When I saw Joan Snyder's retrospective, I think it was at the Jewish Museum, I realized how close the thinking was in the late 60s, early 70s about primary activity and how much narrative you could extract from basically one or two motions. I had a show in '72 at Tibor Danaj, and there were 10 paintings. I named them after the 10 rabbis who were martyred in the Yom Kippur service. And they had names like Amnon and Yeshavab and Husbit. And the critic Donald Cuspit, he's not here, is he? Donald? Okay, good. Donald didn't realize that Husbit was his actual last name, that he was actually named after, his family name was one of these martyred rabbis. And the show went, you know, very nicely. I was, again, trying to imitate Jackson Pollock using some resins. And no one noticed that the titles of the paintings, it got reviewed 4 places. No one made any mention of the fact that these titles were these martyred rabbis. But I was interested in the notion of belief. And as I said before, it's not that I'm proselytizing, it's that I'm interested in that people believe things. I love the idea of belief. It gives life meaning in a way, you know. And also, it was not remarkable to be Jewish. Everybody was Jewish. The dealers, the critics, a lot of the painters, you know, everyone from Larry Rivers to Jules Zalitsky, you know. I mean, whether or not they affiliated was irrelevant. You know, Clem Greenberg, Harold Rosenberg, Castelli, who else was there? Andre Emmerich, you know. It was not an unpopular thing, so I paid no attention to it. Yeah. Then I got this commission, which screwed everything up. My kids were going to the Yeshiva Flatbush, and there was an amazing director there named David H. Schwartz, whose daughter actually is here representing him, much to my happy surprise. I haven't seen Susan in a while. Hi, I'm going to do a Hillary Clinton. You know, and ever notice she does that? You know, it's like she gets up at the podium and she goes, anyway, yeah, she did that. His friend was building a synagogue, a private synagogue, basically. He didn't like the shul he was in. He built one around the corner. And he was going to put wood paneling up because it was a practical thing to do. And Dave said to him, don't be crazy. I got this great artist here. Let him mural the walls. So some deal was cooked up. And I walked in and looked at the entire synagogue and said, yeah, I could do this. Because, again, I had this thing with scale. Like, the bigger it was, the better. So I thought, wow, muraling an entire synagogue. This is really cool. And after I put down the menorah and the Jewish star, I realized I had run out of the entire history of Jewish iconography, and I had 38 panels to go. At the same point, the synagogue murals were put on trial in a religious court, and I was basically brought up for something the Jewish equivalent of excommunication. It was very serious. I wasn't allowed to these hearings, and it was considered that I was making blasphemous or heretical pictures as this hadn't existed. And I maintained that since Dura Europos existed in the 2nd century, which was a synagogue that had a lot of figurative murals, that this was perfectly kosher. And they brought it before a rabbi who was considered the world's leading Talmudic authority, a person named Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And he was about 92 at the time. He decided that the work was not only kosher, but in his own words, the spirit in which it was done was commendable, which basically gave me the good housekeeping seal of approval to continue doing this and to be considered the Jewish artist who actually could do Jewish work. And then Rabbi Feinstein died. So he left me the only guy in the world with this kind of authority because no rabbi came in to fill his place that had that kind of reputation that was respected by all sects of Judaism. So I became this kind of odd duck. I continued having gallery shows, and I continued getting commissions from interested Jewish organizations, being like the guy who did this. So while I'm doing this, I had to come up with all this imagery. I had to come up with basically inventing a Jewish iconography. Judaism is traditionally an iconoclastic religion, but I found that, in fact, it's not. You can have it, but no one ever did it, and the rabbis are not in favor of it for a number of reasons I can discuss later, but I don't want to get into that now. So I basically ended up muraling this entire place. Which was fun. I wrote a contract. I expected it to take me 6 months. It took me 3 years. I got paid for 6 months' work, but I wanted to do it right. But in the meantime, I picked up this whole notion of images that had meaning. Because what I had to do was I had to go to all of the stories that have been sort of woven into the religion as the oral scripture and extract nouns from them. That is, if somebody said to me, God is wonderful and glorious, I'd say, no, I can't use that. They'd say, God sits on a chair. I said, chair, I can paint a chair. You know, so, fish, I got a fish, you know. And I realized that I like doing that. Now, on the right-hand side, you'll see a picture that has a lot of individual pictures in it. That's a wall of miracles, and originally that was the last of the letter paintings. That is, I showed you the one with the big cross and the two little collages on it. This one has about 1,500 small individual paintings glued onto it, and I pressed it into service 3 years later. The picture was originally called Sorrentino, after my friend the poet Gilbert Sorrentino. I pressed it into service as a mural in the synagogue. I just glued it to the wall. This is a later picture. But all of this is flat. It's trompe-l'oeil. I had to do the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. That's the 24-year-old Archie Rand. Then when I came back, in the midst of all of this stuff, you know, Tibor scheduled shows every year. And while I was going through this controversy and getting excommunicated, a lot of younger painters wouldn't talk to me. And they wouldn't talk, that is, people who were my friends, who I'd have beers with at Finelli's and stuff like that, figured A, I was working representationally, and B, I was working religiously, so I was like not to be talked to. But the painters who did support me were the older painters. Jules Litsky and I became very close. Friedel Zubas and I became very close. And strangely and happily enough, Philip Guston and I became very close. And Philip supported this. These guys remembered the WPA, and they saw this basically as a continuation of the mural project. And they shared with me that notion of belief in the public statement of a large-scale painting, which is something I had extracted somehow intuitively from Pollock's work. If you think about mural work, until the invention of oil paint, the Italian Renaissance murals or the murals of other cultures are done basically in tempera. So you can't make a mistake. And one of the problems that oil paint has introduced is the notion of its own malleability. So because it can be moved around, you have the notion of doubt. So a lot of oil painting became, in my generation, this kind of like crossing out different decisions, and you end up with this, you know, what I call the Giacometti effect, where it's, you know, all very Beckett-like, and it's all, it's like that character from Bullwinkle and Natasha, it's all very terrible, it's very dark, it's all awful. And oil paint allows that, but a water-based paint doesn't allow that. You can't make a mistake, and so when you start, you have to have an actual idea of the narrative that you're going to espouse. And that's my attraction to that belief system. So Tibor was very confused by all this, but he liked the work. This is around 1977 or so. That's very Philip Guston paint handling over there. And I decided to get more and more into certain kinds of imagery. That is, you know, what could be done. Then by about 1979, I figured if I'm going to do this, I shouldn't be working large scale. So I bought 100 small canvases. I did 100 small paintings to figure out what I was painting. Never did come to a conclusion, but Tibor showed both of them on the 2 floors of the gallery. Painted a lot of liquor bottles. I studied with Leonard Anderson when I was young, and Leonard said if you want the nose to be prominent, you should do what Ingres did and paint it red, or Degas. So I figured, oh, that's cool. So I painted a red nose. Then I got this commission to do some stained glass windows in Chicago, again based on Jewish iconography, and another commission to do another synagogue in Chicago. These are about 14 feet high, of Abraham. I'm worried about time, but I want to tell this story because it's so cool. Let me go back. If you'll notice, the top of this window is round, and originally what I had planned was for the knife that Abraham sacrifices Isaac with, or is about to, would be curved. And the leader of the congregation said, we can't do that because that's too violent. But if I shorten the knife, then he somehow considered that to be less violent. The guy was a real idiot. So at the opening, I realized I had already called him an idiot. I wasn't going to get any more commissions. His father's there, who basically paid for everything. And I told his father, you know, what his son had told me. And he said in front of the entire congregation, it was a big opening. It's like the biggest synagogue in Chicago. Those of you who know Chicago, it's on Lakeshore Drive, that enormous Reform synagogue, Temple Shalom. And the funder, the guy who owned half of Chicago, turns to me and says, my son said that. And I said, yeah. He says, my son's a horse's ass. So I figured, that's cool. He said that in front of the whole congregation. I'm not going to work here anymore anyway, so what the hell, you know. As Isaac, Jacob. And then I decided to do a bunch of figurative paintings, which I showed around 1981 or 82. And I just like these. But again, I was looking for, this guy's in my living room. When I did this painting, something funny occurred to me. This has nothing to do with the lecture. This is the one aside I think I'm going to give. When I finished this painting, I thought, you know, everybody I want is in this picture. I've got like Manet, I've got Goya, I've got Balthus. I have all these macho, you know, misogynist guys. It's really, really good, regardless of what the historians think about Manet. You know, but I said, but there's a couple of people in this picture I didn't invite. There's like Jim Dine and David Hockney and Francis Bacon. And I thought to myself, you know, if I don't accept them as part of my vocabulary, I'm going to be lying the rest of my life. So for me, this was what Clement Greenberg used to call a breakthrough painting, but it was figurative. I copied that from a picture of Jerry Lee Lewis. Oops, oh damn, did I blow it again? Oh, nuts. Oh, come on, Archie. As you can see, I'm digitally advanced. Come on, come on, come on. I'm sorry, I'll never do that again. I'll be careful with my fingers. Damn. Jerry Lee. Oh, there we go. Okay, so you can see the scale of these things. There's the things you can do if you're not a painter. You can be a bum, you can be a musician, an alcoholic, or you can be a painter. You know. Yeah. The picture on the right is a memorial to Philip Guston. There's a bit of Franz Klein in there and some other stuff. Then I got this commission to do outdoor murals at the Jerusalem Teachers College, and I worked with Mark Golden of Golden Paint and Union Carbide, Siba Geige, Roman Haas, DuPont, a whole bunch of guys, and we tried to come up with a permanent exterior outdoor paint in 110-degree heat and windstorms. And this is the 7 days of creation. Again, all this time I'm trying to be rabbinically observant. I'm trying to do things like the rabbis will okay. So if they point to an object and say, what is that? I can tell them. And it's starting to bother me. Like I got into a fight with, I got to tell this story. I'm sorry. I know I got 45 minutes, but I got to tell this. I'm up on a scaffold. It's like Sunday morning. On Saturday night, all the Jews go out. It's the end of Shabbos. You know, they go out and they get drunk. They have a great time. They go to Tel Aviv, whatever. So Sunday morning, it's totally dead. I'm in Jerusalem up on this scaffold. It's a rickety wooden scaffold. And the head of the library, who doesn't like me, a lot of the people there didn't like what I was doing, comes, I love this. He comes out and says to me, ha. I'm like 40 feet up in the air. I'm looking down at this guy. It's like a De Chirico painting. I'm looking down like this little thing. And he goes, ha. And I said, ha what? He says, you think you can fool them, but you know that I know that you know what I know. And I said, what is it that I know that you know that I know? And he said, you think you can fool them, don't you? And I said, what? He said, I know this isn't art. I said, well, if it's not art, what is it? I'm goofing on the guy, because, you know. He says, and he says very proudly, it's a mishmash. And I said, how do you know it's not art and it's a mishmash? And I told the story twice this year, and I haven't thought of it in like 30 years. And the guy stands back and he says, 10 years ago, for 2 weeks, I lived in Paris. At this point, dealing with the rabbinate is starting to get to me. It took a while. It was a slow burn, but I was really getting tired of these guys. Day 1, day 2. Pay attention to this day 2, that winged figure in the altar in the center there. Day 3, this is the days of creation and all the rabbinical stories that are attached to it. Day 4, oh, I guess I missed a couple. Anyway, I get back to the Phyllis Kine Gallery. I switched from Tibor to Phyllis, and being with Phyllis was tremendously liberating. I don't think Phyllis has ever gotten her due as being like one of the craziest things to happen in the 80s and 70s in New York. Everybody's showing Clem Greenberg work, and Phyllis is showing like Ed Paschke, Roger Brown, Jim Nutt, Carl Worsam. It's like bananas. And I was showing with Phyllis, and I felt a freedom I hadn't felt before. And I came back from Jerusalem with all of these images in my head. So as you can see, in the upper left-hand corner is that day 2 from the Jerusalem murals. And a couple of critics noticed that there was something Jewish in the paintings. And I figured, you know, it's about time that I stopped separating them and just let everything flow into one piece of work. As Leanne read before, I had 2 separate reputations. And I figured I just can't do this anymore. Just let it collapse. So, and there's the 7 days of creation on the bottom with a Jimmy Swinnerton and the creation of the universe. It's a cartoon that I copied. That painting actually is about 16 feet long, but I had fun copying Jimmy Swinnerton. So around 1985, I started doing a series of rabbi paintings. in this cartoon style. I'm getting very interested in cartoons because I realized that if you're going to make a Jewish language, for whatever reasons, I was interested in this kind of crap, you have to find something that doesn't come out of the Western tradition. And I realized that the only thing I could lay claim to was that the comic book industry was run almost entirely by Jews. So guys like Will Eisner, who was the godfather of, who gave birth to like, everyone from Stan Lee to Art Spiegelman, Jules Pfeiffer, the Jewish comic books of the 40s, 50s, mostly EC and mostly Mad Magazine. There was an interview with Al Jaffe a couple of months ago, a writer and artist for Mad, where he said, from 1952 to 1971, every issue of Mad Magazine had one Yiddish word in it. And I thought, wow, that's like, that's cool. I related to people like, Lenny Bruce, the non-Jewish Ernie Kovacs. That was in the air. Being a Brooklyn wise guy, I kind of liked that. And I sort of thought that I would adopt a comic book style as a legitimate style that I could use to express myself. This picture got reproduced a number of times, the New York Times, Vogue magazine, and I got the feeling they were reproducing it because they were being cynical. They thought I was making fun. But I wasn't making fun. I just didn't want to paint a bunch of dancing Hasidim with light coming out of them or people lighting candles and being very holy. I just wanted to paint a Jewish-looking picture. And I kept in mind that the reaction to this was very supportive. The reviews were very good, but it was reviewed in terms of like, you see, we can make fun of this. And I didn't want to make fun of it. I just wanted it to be a language that could be imposed into the larger aesthetic dialogue. And what I recently said in fact, I said it here in the introduction to the 613, I said that the art world is where a lot of Jews go to assimilate. And being from New York, I didn't really feel I needed to. I could be who I was. So I did a bunch of hokey pictures. That's a Hanukkah picture. I kind of like that. Then I got this commission to do a mural at the Hebrew Home of Greater Washington, which was in fresco. So this is on plaster. And they wanted me to illustrate the evening prayer, which is a weird thing to put into an old age home because the prayer basically says, when I go to sleep tonight, I hope I'll wake up in the morning. I figured, well, it's their choice, But again, I illustrated every piece of rabbinical commentary that was there, still trying to be textually obedient to the rabbinical demands. Fresco's fun, by the way. When I got back to Phyllis, I was even more nuts, because once you do this thing with iconography, you just want to invent whatever you can. So I'm just going to show one of maybe 100 pictures. There's Darryl Strawberry. Those two characters on top, of course, are Will Elder from Mad Magazine, for those of you who are Mad aficionados. Then I did this series called Mainly Merry Spirits. I started to write books. So this is a 27-painting series that I wrote my own text for, of the life of an artist. They're about 6 feet high. And then I did another series. Now I'm going to talk about, and then, like the guy who says, and then I wrote, I'm going to go through a whole bunch of series. This is like the musicians, the performance. These are about 6 feet wide. The professions, these are process servers, alcoholics, nightclub performers, unemployed people. These are smaller. Did some potato prints. That's the largest potato print in the world, by the way. Then I was working off Rilke's Sonnets to Orpheus. 29 pictures after book 2 of Sonnets to Orpheus. They're all self-portraits. It's kind of Egon Schiele gets fat. Then John Yao and I were doing this gig at Bard, and we decided to do some collaborative work together. And at first we started doing prints, and then I said, this is too slow. Let's do watercolors. And we did, by my estimation, about 200 watercolors, and some of them are really funny. Phyllis showed them in the basement. Phyllis would show anything I did. It was great. But they're funny. I climbed out of the vat of self-indulgence and sang the blues. John had a kind of acid, still does, to his writing, and I was kind of sweet. So it was a kind of Lennon-McCartney thing. I was the oil, he was the vinegar, but together it was like a third thing. Like these are bigger than the pictures and bigger than the words, and I like that. And the idea of a collaboration with a poet became very important to me. And a few years later, I would read that Wallace Stevens had written that poetry is where you go when religion has lost its ability to convey the truth, that poetry becomes the truth. And I'd always been friends with poets. As I mentioned, when I was hanging out with Gil Sorrentino when I was like 15, 16 years old. That crowd included Amiri Baraka, Robert Creeley, Denise Levertov, the old St. Mark's group, and to some degree, Joel Oppenheimer, Paul Blackburn, very close. But these are people that basically brought me up. So I had a lot of love for poetry and still do. And I believe that Wallace Stevens had a point in that poetry is actually the truth when religion loses its ability to be that truth. And conversely, William Carlos Williams also says that in Asphodel, he says that the poem is news. So I took to the poem as something I could invest belief in, probably for the first time since the letter paintings, when I invested belief in the music that saved my life. Now poetry was going to save my life, and I could work with living poets. This was a revelation to me. We did an alphabet together on gold lame, which has never been shown. Then in 1989, I did a series based on the 54 divisions into which the Torah is divided by the Jews who read it every Saturday in synagogue. And when I showed them to the curators at the Jewish Museum, they said, "We can't show these, they're too Jewish." And I said, "If you can't show them, who can?" So they concocted this show to sort of dull the edge of these pictures, because the embarrassment about their attachment to religiosity was too much to bear. It just wasn't aesthetically or discursively adequate. That's Noah's Ark. There's a chapter on blood. It's the cave Sarah dies in. There's a parable about stones. There's blood coming out of Miriam as well. Then I got really frustrated. I thought to myself, what I really should do is I should do what Pollock did. I should just paint myself into oblivion, and then if I just keep painting and keep painting and keep painting, I will snap. Some catalyst will happen. So I did 20 triptychs, about 6 by 12 feet, hoping that something would snap. And what happened was I painted every language I could think of, but nothing snapped. So I decided to go back to the abstraction I abandoned, and I worked just in black and white, again, serially. This is around 1989, 1990. As you can see, I had fun. And then I said, well, okay, abstraction is a language. I think all of those pictures convey some kind of message. I wasn't sure what, and I wanted to get more specific, but I was sick of the rabbis. So in 1991-92, for the first time, I threw the rabbis out because I realized that since Judaism has no enzymes for the visual digestion of any material, it was crazy for me to take commentary from the rabbis. There's no visual in Judaism. So basically, I decided that the image had to take primacy over the text. So I did something called 60 Paintings from the Bible, which is now a show in Cleveland. That's the book. It only took 30 years for someone to pick up on this. And I was looking at Classics Illustrated, and I thought, let me translate the Bible as it actually is. Instead of saying, verily thou hast come to seeth me offeth, it says, hey, come here. So I did some literal translations, like, Esther, what's the matter? Is someone out to get you? Who is it? Is it Haman? Yes? Well, then hang him. Hang Haman on the gallows, which is basically what it says. Adam looks at Eve and says, we're naked. Cut the kid in half and give one half to each mother. It's kind of like what Solomon actually says. Did a series based on Nachmanides' letter to his son, which is a crazy thing to do. It occurred to me, I went to the Frick, and there's this wonderful painting, The Forge, which every painter I know loves. And it's huge, and it's these guys stripped to the waist, and they're sweating at night, and they're hitting a hot anvil with a fire around it and a hammer. And I'm thinking, Goya did this painting for who? Like, where do you hang this picture? You hang it in your breakfast nook while their armpits are dripping sweat into your oatmeal? Like, what's the point of this picture? And I realized, oh, you don't have to paint a picture necessarily for public absorption. You just paint it because you need to paint it. So there is no market for Nachmanides' letter to his son, but I just wanted to do it. At this point, I start to phase out the notion of working for the discourse. All of this is relevant to where we end up. Like, who's going to buy this? Frankly, nobody. A set of Sicilian cards that have been co-opted to parallel the 10 plagues. The Hebrew on the bottom is the same on all the cards. It says, and the rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. There are 40 cards in a Sicilian deck. I was interested in this kind of correlation. Psalm 68, the most indecipherable psalm of all of them. Makes no sense. This is 94. You know, as smoke disperses, disperse them. As wax melts in front of a fire, let the wicked perish in the face of God. Now, who the hell's going to hang that in their house, you know? I mean, maybe Jerry Falwell, you know. I realized that there were 22 major arcana in the Tarot, and there's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. And the history of the iconography of the Hebrew alphabet and the stories of the Tarot deck are fairly parallel. So I did some paintings that correspond to that. This is called Kabbalah Tarot. Then I realized I wanted to get back to poetry. So I did a series based on Samuel Beckett Paul Eluard's poem Solitude, where I wrote the entire poem on a series of 15 paintings. This is some of them. It's another series based on 2 songs from Passover, which I glommed together. But again, the cartoon characters are there. There's a lot of layering, a lot of technical stuff about. I wanted to make pictures that were unphotographable. I was tired of people learning about art through photographs. Like, I know people who think Mondrian painted, you know, flat pictures when they're deliciously creamy, you know. This is Jack Spicer's entire A Book of Music, which gratefully has no copyright date on it. So I copied the entire poem onto individual pictures. This is a series of red paintings. There are 60 of them, and I was interested in the surface, about how the gold and the layering of the acrylic paint allows the surface to reflect. Did a series of works with Clark Coolidge. The French publisher Gervais Assou gave me 40 books with about 20 pages each, and Clark's poem was written on it, and I was very invigorated by having this project. So 20 times 20 is it's 400 drawings. So each book is unique, and each book has 20 individual drawings in it. So I'll show you a couple of those. This is basically ballpoint pen and watercolor. They're just cold. You know. Then I got this other commission to do the basement of the same synagogue. And while I'm doing it, I thought to myself, if I'm painting this on the walls, why can't I paint these on canvases? So you'll see a lot of these glyphs show up again. This is on cinder block. So I decided to take the Jewish prayer, the 18, it's called the Shemona Esrei, the Amida prayer, and do an individual painting for each one based on the murals I had just completed. Went to Siena, did a series of about 60 watercolors. There's a show right now at the Interchurch Center on 120th Riverside Drive where I have some of these paintings displayed right now. The idea here is to show my attraction to serial work. Cecilia Whitaker Doe and Don Doe are in the audience. They opened a gallery called the SRO Gallery, and they allowed me to show Men Who Turn Back by Eugenio Montale, which is a poem that I adore, and I committed to canvas some 30 years ago, and I'd never shown them. So I recently had an exhibition there. Thank you, Cecilia and Don. And this is what the installation looked like a couple of months ago. Montale is one of my top 3 favorite all-time poets. Paul Celan, Cleared. The entire poem is in 4 things. This is a poem written on the suicide of a friend of his. Cleared for this departure too. Song of the front wheel with Corona. The rudder of dusk engages you. Your slit awake vein untangles. What's left of you sets itself aslant. you gain altitude. I love this series. It was shown once. I think Keith Mayerson put this in a MoCA show, the cartoon place. A series of 7 days of creation. Much to my happy surprise, I found after Jules Olitsky's death, Jules was very good to me. After Jules's death, his wife Christina told me that when this series of paintings was shown at the American Jewish Historical Society on 16th Street many years ago, and you had to pay admission, it was like $5 to get in, that Jules came back 4 times to see the show, and I almost cried. I figured, wow, if I'd only known. Jules was very, very supportive. This is a series I did with Robert Creeley, 54 lithographs, which was later published by Steve Clay, for which I'm very grateful, in a book called Drawn and Quartered, Granary Press. Creeley was amazing, absolutely amazing. He, in fact, later published these poems that he did in response to these pictures as an individual piece called Drawn and Quartered in New Directions. I wish he would have printed the pictures, but the poems stand by themselves. They're beautiful. A series of the 39 Forbidden Labors of Sabbath, another obscure topic that nobody gives a rat's ass about. I just wanted to do it because it hadn't been done. I'm interested in doing things I haven't seen. When I worked for Larry Poons, Barnett Newman would come over once in a while. Barney was Larry's mentor. And I once served him coffee. And I remember Barney saying, painters paint so they can have something to look at. So I thought, I've never seen this. Let me do this. So this is not moving anything for the construction of a house, untying a knot. Went to Sicily, did a series of Mount Etna. That's the second part of the show that's up at the Riverside Interchurch Center now. There's about 60 of these. They're small, they're about 9 by 12. Then I got back to worrying about faith. I keep questioning that. Now I figure if I'm going to use faith, I really have to do something that's close to me. Again, it's not a religious thing, it's a kind of belief thing, and I want to make that difference clear. So this is 19 paintings based on the same prayer. This is Eve, Cain and Abel, Abraham, Esther and Mordecai. Then I started a series with John Ashbery. We did about 48 paintings based on his poem, Heavenly Days Illuminated, which John and I just call HDI. And at this point, I felt very free. John and I are both very, very happy with this series. And I realized that when I saw the poem, and as John was working on it and changing it, I saw the changes, that the voice of the poem was coming from his house. John lives in an amazing kind of antique house that he keeps up in very good shape. And the voice of the poem sounded like it was coming out of the walls. So I did 48 paintings of the interior of his house to complement the poem. So this is part of it. They could croon. A poem by Yehuda Amichai, God's Change, Prayers Are Here to Stay. Oh, what do you know? I hope they're all not this screwed up. Another commission in Texas based on these were about 15 feet high, actually. That's about 30 feet across. The novelist David Plant and I met at Columbia University. We became very close. And David and I David showed me a book of 651 one-liners and said very nonchalantly, could you do some pictures for these? So I took 700 pieces of paper with me to Sicily, sat by the pool, and all summer long I turned out 651 pictures, which went with the poems. And we've never shown these aside from this one day we put them up at Columbia University to see what they looked like, and they look great. I had a show in '99, I think, at these slides are out of focus, that's all I had, the Paolo Baldacci Gallery. They had 2 shows. They had my show followed by Jim Hyde's show. And then the gallery closed. So I was very grateful. I think that Jim, in fact, Jim's here someplace, was instrumental, hey there, in getting the show booked, and I'm glad he did, because otherwise these paintings never would have been shown. This painting's about 35 feet long. And as you can see, it's made up of small comic book characters separated by masking tape, painted on blue denim. And these are some other paintings in the show, again, with all these comic book characters. I'm trying to identify something comic booky. Did a series based on the Passover song Chad Gadya, which I found from my wife's family. They actually sing in Sicily. So this song probably predates Judaism. It probably is about 20,000 years old. And if you'll notice, on the wall is the beginning of what will become the 613. So the 613 was done from 2001 to 2006. And in the meantime, I've done many of the things I've shown you. And when I had a break, I would knock off literally 3 or 4 of these a day, just like paint the images in. These are painted on red vinyl, which is the Jewish immigrant equivalent of plush red leather, which my grandmother had these vinyl chairs with the brass tacks in them and the kind of pillowed out. And I thought, that's a very immigrant material. I mean, you see other cultures. I see the Italian Americans and Latino culture also is very fond of this fake leather. So there's the 613 in progress. That's what it looked like in the studio, but I was never able to see it up because it was just too darn big, so I was doing it in sections. And finally, I got it up on the wall. That's a scale shot. And that's how it looked, 100 feet by 17 feet. And it goes back to those murals I was talking about when I first started, about the notion of doing public scale murals based on a communally held belief. So I realized only when I started to put this talk together that there was a connection between my earliest work and some of my latest work. The outsides are painted in gold, the borders, and the insides are painted rather matte. By 1985, when I did the rabbi's painting, it occurred to me that an artist named Basil Wolverton, whom I admired greatly because he worked for Mad Magazine, was also a devout member of something called the Church of God, which was started by a man named Herbert Armstrong. And he became sort of a deacon in the church. And while he was making these incredible drawings for Mad Magazine, he was also making drawings for Herbert Armstrong's publications, which were purely, deeply religious Christian work. And the dichotomy of that struck me. It was reproduced in 1982. And Robert Crumb was very influenced by that as well when he did his book of Genesis. The Wolverton drawings are kind of fascinating because of where he was able to place his belief. So this is an overall shot of the 613. This is to know there is a God, to sanctify the Sabbath by drinking the wine and lighting the conclusionary candle, not to be sneaky, to bring 2 gifts to the temple, to blow the shofar, to not have impure thoughts, to punish the idolater, to not fall off the path of the right way, to bring 2 loaves of bread for the Sabbath service. The priest should wash his hands and face before ministering, to salt all sacrifices, not to cut your hair, not to eat maggots. The son should not have homosexual relations with the father. You should not have sexual relations with a beast. You shouldn't have sexual relations with your sister. You shouldn't have sexual relations with your mother. You should build a building strong and not be distracted. You should bring a palm branch and a citron, the Jewish people call the lulav and the etrog, to the holiday of Sukkot, the feast of Pentecost. You should wear phylacteries on your head, which basically burst through the 7 layers of heaven. You should not save the false prophet. I love that one. You should not profane God's name. Giraffes have no vocal cords. You should pray. Women should not wear men's clothes. Men should not wear women's clothes. You shouldn't try to contact the dead. You should know the laws of menstrual purity. When this went up in 2008, I got a nasty letter from a religious Jewish woman who said, "What does an egg have to do with menstruation?" Jews have no visual enzymes to digest, like I said. It's hopeless. You should blend the anointing oil, return the lost object, and not insult people with words. Okay, that's it.